Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that's going to make you question everything you thought you knew about the Middle Ages. Because here's the thing about the medieval world that history class never quite got around to telling you. It wasn't just knights and plagues and people who forgot to bathe. It was a world absolutely drenched in conspiracy, and not the tinfoil hat variety, not the moon is made of cheese kind. Real conspiracies. Organised, calculated, terrifyingly effective plots hatched in dark rooms by powerful people who had everything to gain and absolutely no moral objection to getting blood on their hands. We tend to think of conspiracies as a modern affliction, something born from the internet age, from comment sections and rabbit holes and too many hours alone with a laptop. But conspiracies are as old as power itself. The moment someone had something, someone else was plotting to take it. And the medieval period, stretching roughly from the fall of Rome in the 5th century to the dawn of the Renaissance in the 15th, was arguably the most conspiracy-soaked era in human history. Kings plotting against popes, popes plotting against kings, merchants bribing judges, nobles poisoning relatives, secret societies pulling strings behind tapestried walls. The whole era was one long, elaborate scheme played out across cathedrals, counting houses, and candlelit cellars. Consider the conditions that made medieval conspiracy so fertile. Information moved slowly, which meant that lies had enormous lifespans. A rumour could travel from Paris to London in the time it took a rider to exhaust 3 horses, and by the time it arrived it had already been reshaped by every hand it passed through. The absence of a free press meant no independent verification of official accounts. The church controlled literacy in large parts of Europe for centuries, which meant that the people who could read and write were the people with the greatest institutional interest in managing what was recorded and what was silently omitted. Courts were controlled by the powerful. Judges could be threatened or bought, witnesses could be made to disappear, or simply persuaded with enough silver that their memory was faulty. In this environment, conspiracy wasn't just possible, it was rational. If you were powerful and you wanted something done that couldn't be done openly, conspiracy was often the most efficient available tool. And if you were not powerful, and someone more powerful than you was conspiring against you, your options for recourse were vanishingly few. You could appeal to a higher lord, who might be in on it. You could appeal to the church, which might be the problem. You could appeal to public opinion, if you could reach enough people fast enough, before your opponent reached them first, with a more convincing version of events. Or you could disappear quietly, which was frequently what happened. And the truly remarkable thing? Many of those schemes, the ones that were whispered about for generations, that ordinary people pointed to with knowing looks and hushed voices, turned out to be absolutely true. Not rumours, not folk tales, not the paranoid fantasies of peasants with too much time between harvests. True, documented, proven by later historians who dug through the archives and found the receipts. So before we get started, take a second to hit the subscribe button if this is your kind of late night content, and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I genuinely love seeing that. Now settle in, maybe turn down the lights a little, and let's go back to a world where the conspiracy theorists were often the only ones telling the truth. Chapter 1. The Murder of Thomas Becket and the King Who Ordered It. Let's start with one of the most explosive conspiracies in English history. A story that at the time had everyone pointing fingers, whispering behind their hands, and insisting that things were not what they appeared to be. The story of Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, and the 4 knights who walked into his cathedral on a cold December evening in 1170 and ended his life. Now, officially, no one gave the order. Officially, King Henry II of England was horrified, devastated even. He did public penance for the act, walked barefoot through Canterbury, and let monks flog him as a symbol of his contrition. All very convincing, all very medieval theatre. But here's what people whispered at the time, and here's what historians have since confirmed beyond reasonable doubt. Henry gave the order. Maybe not in explicit terms, maybe not with a written document sealed with his royal ring and filed in triplicate, but he gave it. The backstory matters enormously here. Thomas Becket and Henry II had once been the closest of friends. More than friends, really. Companions, partners. The king's most trusted man. Henry had actually appointed Becket as Archbishop of Canterbury precisely because he thought Becket would be loyal, a useful ally within the church, someone who would support royal authority over ecclesiastical power. It was the perfect political move, except it backfired in spectacular fashion. The moment Becket became Archbishop, he transformed. The ambitious, worldly chancellor who had feasted and hunted with the king became a pious, obstinate defender of church independence, who seemed to take a particular pleasure in frustrating royal authority at every turn. The two men clashed repeatedly over the rights of the church versus the rights of the crown. Becket excommunicated bishops who supported the king. Henry tried to exile him. The conflict dragged on for years, festering and poisoning everything around it. By 1170, Henry had reached his limit. The phrase attributed to him, and the historians have argued about its exact wording ever since, was something along the lines of, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" Some accounts say he was more explicit. Some say he threw himself on the floor in a rage. Whatever he said, 4 knights heard it, took it as royal instruction, and immediately set out for Canterbury. Here's where the conspiracy angle becomes undeniable. These were not random hotheads acting on impulse. Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, and Richard le Breton were experienced, senior knights with everything to lose. They didn't act on a whim. They acted on what they understood to be a royal command, however it was phrased, and they expected reward, not punishment. They arrived at Canterbury Cathedral on the evening of December 29th, 1170. They found Becket in the gathering dark. Words were exchanged. Becket refused to flee, and then they did what they had come to do. The immediate aftermath was precisely what you'd expect when 4 knights murder an archbishop in his own cathedral. Outrage, international scandal. Pope Alexander III was furious. Henry was potentially facing excommunication himself. The political fallout was catastrophic, so Henry performed his penance. He wept, apparently with genuine emotion, though whether that emotion was grief, guilt, or political calculation is something historians still debate. He denied giving a direct order. The 4 knights were technically excommunicated, but never meaningfully punished. They kept their lands, they kept their titles. One of them, de Morville, died peacefully in his own bed decades later. The conspiracy was confirmed not by a dramatic confession, but by the weight of evidence, the knight's own behaviour in the aftermath. The fact that Henry's rage at Becket had been common knowledge at court for years, the speed and coordination with which 4 senior men acted, the relative mildness of their actual punishment. Putting it all together, the picture is clear. Henry II wanted Becket dead. Henry II got what he wanted. And then Henry II performed enough public grief to avoid the worst political consequences. It was, by any modern standard, a conspiracy to commit murder by a sitting monarch against an archbishop of the church. And it worked almost perfectly. The only thing Henry didn't account for was how quickly Becket would become a martyr. Within 3 years, Becket was canonised. Within a century, Canterbury had become one of the most important pilgrimage sites in the Christian world. The shrine that Henry's rage helped create became so wealthy and so beloved that another English king, Henry VIII, would eventually have to destroy it just to break its power. There is also something worth noting about the texture of the conspiracy. Henry's exact words, whatever they were, gave him what lawyers today would call deniability. He expressed a wish. He did not issue a command. The knights acted on that wish because they knew their king well enough to understand what he wanted, and because they expected gratitude, not prosecution. That gap between expressed wish and direct order is one of the oldest tools in the powerful person's toolkit. It allows the one at the top to benefit from an action while remaining technically innocent of ordering it. Whether it's a medieval king venting rage at a cathedral dinner and watching 4 knights leave the room with purpose, or a modern executive who discovers things he conveniently never asked to know, the mechanism is ancient and remarkably consistent. Even the conspiracy had consequences that conspired against the conspirators. That's medieval politics for you. Chapter 2. The Princes in the Tower and the Uncle Who Made Them Disappear. Few mysteries in English history have generated more argument, more ink, more dramatic productions, and more furious scholarly debate than the fate of the 2 young princes who vanished into the Tower of London in 1483 and were never seen again. Edward V, 12 years old. Richard, Duke of York, 9 years old, 2 children, 1 tower, and 1 uncle who had very obvious reasons to want them gone. Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Later, Richard III, the man Shakespeare turned into a limping, scheming villain so effectively that even now, centuries later, people are still arguing about whether the portrait is fair. Here's the situation as it stood in 1483. Edward IV, the prince's father, died unexpectedly. Edward V was set to be crowned king, with his uncle Richard as Lord Protector. Power was supposed to transfer smoothly. Instead, Richard moved fast. He intercepted the young king's party on the road to London, arrested key members of the Queen's family who had been guiding the boy, and assumed control. He installed the princes in the Tower, initially presented as standard pre-coronation accommodation, because Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that's going to make you question everything you thought you knew about the Middle Ages. Because here's the thing about the medieval world that history class never quite got around to telling you. It wasn't just knights and plagues and people who forgot to bathe. It was a world absolutely drenched in conspiracy, and not the tinfoil hat variety, not the moon is made of cheese kind. Real conspiracies. Organised, calculated, terrifyingly effective plots hatched in dark rooms by powerful people who had everything to gain and absolutely no moral objection to getting blood on their hands. We tend to think of conspiracies as a modern affliction, something born from the internet age, from comment sections and rabbit holes and too many hours alone with a laptop. But conspiracies are as old as power itself. The moment someone had something, someone else was plotting to take it. And the medieval period, stretching roughly from the fall of Rome in the 5th century to the dawn of the Renaissance in the 15th, was arguably the most conspiracy-soaked era in human history. Kings plotting against popes, popes plotting against kings, merchants bribing judges, nobles poisoning relatives, secret societies pulling strings behind tapestried walls. The whole era was one long, elaborate scheme played out across cathedrals, counting houses, and candle-lit cellars. Consider the conditions that made medieval conspiracy so fertile. Information moved slowly, which meant that lies had enormous lifespans. A rumour could travel from Paris to London in the time it took a rider to exhaust 3 horses, and by the time it arrived it had already been reshaped by every hand it passed through. The absence of a free press meant no independent verification of official accounts. The Church controlled literacy in large parts of Europe for centuries, which meant that the people who could read and write were the people with the greatest institutional interest in managing what was recorded and what was silently omitted. Courts were controlled by the powerful. Judges could be threatened or bought. Witnesses could be made to disappear. or simply persuaded with enough silver that their memory was faulty. In this environment, conspiracy wasn't just possible, it was rational. If you were powerful and you wanted something done that couldn't be done openly, conspiracy was often the most efficient available tool. And if you were not powerful, and someone more powerful than you was conspiring against you, your options for recourse were vanishingly few. You could appeal to a higher lord, who might be in on it. You could appeal to the church, which might be the problem. You could appeal to public opinion, if you could reach enough people fast enough, before your opponent reached them first, with a more convincing version of events. Or you could disappear quietly, which was frequently what happened. And the truly remarkable thing? Many of those schemes, the ones that were whispered about for generations, that ordinary people pointed to with knowing looks and hushed voices, turned out to be absolutely true. Not rumours, not folk tales, not the paranoid fantasies of peasants with too much time between harvests. True, documented, proven by later historians who dug through the archives and found the receipts. So before we get started, take a second to hit the subscribe button if this is your kind of late night content, and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I genuinely love seeing that. Now settle in, maybe turn down the lights a little, and let's go back to a world where the conspiracy theorists were often the only ones telling the truth. Chapter 1. The Murder of Thomas Becket and the King Who Ordered It. Let's start with one of the most explosive conspiracies in English history. A story that at the time had everyone pointing fingers, whispering behind their hands, and insisting that things were not what they appeared to be. The story of Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, and the 4 knights who walked into his cathedral on a cold December evening in 1170 and ended his life. Now, officially, no one gave the order. Officially, King Henry II of England was horrified. Devastated even. He did public penance for the act, walked barefoot through Canterbury, and let monks flog him as a symbol of his contrition. All very convincing, all very medieval theatre. But here's what people whispered at the time, and here's what historians have since confirmed beyond reasonable doubt. Henry gave the order. Maybe not in explicit terms, maybe not with a written document sealed with his royal ring and filed in triplicate, but he gave it. The backstory matters enormously here. Thomas Becket and Henry II had once been the closest of friends. More than friends, really. Companions, partners. The king's most trusted man. Henry had actually appointed Becket as Archbishop of Canterbury precisely because he thought Becket would be loyal, a useful ally within the church, someone who would support royal authority over ecclesiastical power. It was the perfect political move, except it backfired in spectacular fashion. The moment Becket became Archbishop, he transformed. The ambitious, worldly chancellor who had feasted and hunted with the king became a pious, obstinate defender of church independence, who seemed to take a particular pleasure in frustrating royal authority at every turn. The 2 men clashed repeatedly over the rights of the church versus the rights of the crown. Becket excommunicated bishops who supported the king. Henry tried to exile him. The conflict dragged on for years, festering and poisoning everything around it. By 1170, Henry had reached his limit. The phrase attributed to him, and the historians have argued about its exact wording ever since, was something along the lines of, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" Some accounts say he was more explicit. Some say he threw himself on the floor in a rage. Whatever he said, 4 knights heard it, took it as royal instruction, and immediately set out for Canterbury. Here's where the conspiracy angle becomes undeniable. These were not random hotheads acting on impulse. Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, and Richard le Breton were experienced, senior knights with everything to lose. They didn't act on a whim. They acted on what they understood to be a royal command, however it was phrased, and they expected reward, not punishment. They arrived at Canterbury Cathedral on the evening of December 29th, 1170. They found Becket in the gathering dark. Words were exchanged. Becket refused to flee, and then they did what they had come to do. The immediate aftermath was precisely what you'd expect when 4 knights murder an archbishop in his own cathedral. Outrage, international scandal. Pope Alexander III was furious. Henry was potentially facing excommunication. In October 1307, Philip moved with stunning coordination. Sealed orders were delivered simultaneously across France to be opened on the same day. The message inside was electrifying. The Knights Templar were to be arrested immediately on charges of heresy, blasphemy, and obscene secret rituals. The specific accusations were lurid and specific. The Templars, it was alleged, required new initiates to deny Christ 3 times, to spit on the cross, to engage in deeply improper acts during their secret ceremonies, to worship an idol called Baphomet, a mysterious head or figure whose exact nature was described differently in different testimonies. The arrests happened on Friday, October 13th, 1307. Yes, that Friday the 13th, the one that gave the date its ominous reputation. Hundreds of Templars across France were seized simultaneously and subjected to interrogation. The interrogations were not gentle. Confessions were extracted under severe duress. Under those conditions, people will confess to almost anything. And here is where the conspiracy becomes layered and fascinating. The charges against the Templars were almost certainly fabricated, or at the very least grotesquely exaggerated. The confessions were obtained through methods that no modern court would consider reliable. When the torture stopped, many Templars recanted their confessions immediately. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, confessed under duress, then recanted publicly, then was burned as a relapsed heretic in 1314, famously cursing Philip IV and Pope Clement V from the flames. Both men died within the year, which did nothing to calm the supernatural atmosphere surrounding the whole affair. The Vatican's own investigation, conducted independently, found far more ambiguous results than Philip's inquisitors. The Papal Commission heard testimony from Templars who described the kiss of peace at certain ceremonies, an ambiguous ritual gesture that could be distorted into something scandalous. With enough creative description, they heard about a denial of Christ that was, by some accounts, merely a test of obedience rather than genuine apostasy. The picture that emerged was of an order with some unusual and secretive initiation practices, not a satanic cult. But the conspiracy to destroy them worked. Pope Clement V, himself largely under French influence, dissolved the order at the Council of Vienne in 1312. Their assets were formally transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, though in practice Philip absorbed vast amounts of Templar wealth. The order that had helped pioneer modern banking, had fought in the Crusades, and had protected pilgrims for 2 centuries, was erased by a king who needed their money and was willing to manufacture any charge necessary to take it. The conspiracy here is breathtaking in its scope. The simultaneous arrests across the entire country, the coordinated accusations, the carefully applied pressure on a compliant pope, the extraction of confessions that could be used to justify the predetermined conclusion. Philip IV didn't just want to steal from the Templars, he wanted to destroy their reputation so thoroughly that no one would question the theft. He almost succeeded. The myth of the evil Templars proved remarkably durable, feeding centuries of conspiracy theories that ironically helped obscure the real conspiracy, the one Philip used to wipe them out. There is a particularly dark irony in the Templar affair that deserves attention. The Templars had actually anticipated something like this. They had enemies, wealthy institutions always do. Their network of fortresses and commanderies across Europe was not merely an administrative convenience, it was also a defensive system, a way of distributing their assets and their people so that no single blow could eliminate the entire organization. And yet Philip's coordinated arrests in France were so complete and so sudden that this system provided almost no protection. The Templars in France were caught entirely off guard. Why? Partly because the conspiracy was genuinely well executed. The sealed orders, opened simultaneously across France, were a remarkable piece of logistical planning for the 14th century, but partly because the Templars had simply never imagined that a Christian king would move against them in this way. They had fought for Christendom. They had taken vows of poverty and obedience and worn the cross. The idea that a king would frame them as devil worshippers to steal their property was, from inside the order, almost incomprehensible, which made them perfectly vulnerable to precisely that move. History has gradually cleared their name. Modern historians are broadly sceptical of the charges, the absurdity of the accusations, the conditions under which confessions were obtained, the speed and coordination of the arrests, and the remarkably convenient timing all point in the same direction. This was a frame-up, a conspiracy dressed up as a trial, and for a while it worked perfectly. Chapter 4. The Poisoners of the Medici Court. Poison. The word alone carries a particular medieval weight, and no name is more associated with the art and administration of poison in the medieval and early Renaissance world than the Medici family of Florence. The Medici are famous today primarily as patrons of the arts, the banking dynasty that funded Michelangelo and Botticelli and helped finance the Renaissance itself. And that's all true. But there's another layer to the Medici story, one that contemporaries whispered about in terrified tones, and that historians have since been able to partially verify through a combination of documentary evidence, autopsy records, and forensic analysis of centuries-old remains. The Medici poisoned people. This was not merely rumoured. It was, for a significant period, accepted as near certainty by those close enough to court politics to have any sense of how things actually worked. The question was never really whether the Medici used poison. The question was who, when, and how often. Let's be precise about the historical context. Medieval and Renaissance Italy was extraordinarily dangerous territory for anyone with power, wealth, or enemies, which meant anyone with power or wealth automatically had enemies. The peninsula was divided into competing city-states that were in perpetual conflict with each other. Florence, Venice, Milan, Naples, Rome, and a dozen lesser powers were constantly manoeuvring for advantage. In this environment, assassination was not a scandal. It was a tool of statecraft, and poison was the most elegant tool available because it was so difficult to detect and so easy to attribute to natural causes. The Medici were intimately connected with the story of Italian poisoning in several ways. First, their banking network gave them access to exotic substances from across the known world. The same trade routes that brought silks from Persia and spices from the Levant also brought less reputable goods from apothecaries and herbalists who knew exactly what certain plants and minerals could do to a human body in the right concentration. Second, the Medici were enmeshed in the politics of the papal curia, where poisoning was so common that it had developed its own vocabulary, its own specialists, and its own market. Several members of the extended Medici family became popes. The Borgia family, who were competing with the Medici in the upper levels of Italian power, were famously accused of poisoning so many rivals that their name became synonymous with the practice. But the Borgia didn't invent a tradition. They inherited and refined one. The case that has received the most historical attention in recent decades is that of Isabella de' Medici, daughter of Duke Cosimo I, who died in 1576 at the age of 34. At the time, her death was attributed to natural causes, but the circumstances were suspicious enough that rumours of foul play circulated almost immediately. Isabella had been having an affair. Her husband, Paolo Giordano Orsini, had discovered it, and Paolo Giordano had connections, temperament, and motive. In 2009 and 2010, forensic scientists were permitted to examine the remains of several Medici family members, including Isabella, from their tombs in Florence. The results were deeply interesting. Isabella's remains showed no evidence of the kind of wasting disease that often explained sudden aristocratic deaths at the time. The skeletal evidence was consistent with a sudden death rather than a prolonged illness. The forensic team also examined the remains of other Medici family members and found evidence consistent with arsenic poisoning in several cases, including young children who had died mysteriously. Arsenic, the great equalizer, was the poison of choice in Renaissance Italy, precisely because its symptoms, nausea, weakness, gradual organ failure, could easily be mistaken for any number of naturally occurring illnesses. The broader pattern of suspicious Medici deaths paints a picture of a dynasty that operated in a world where poison was a real and regularly employed political instrument. Bianca Capello, the second wife of Francesco I de' Medici, died in 1587 within 11 days of her husband, immediately after a feast at which the two of them had apparently eaten the same food. The official story was fever. The unofficial story, then and now, is that both were poisoned, possibly by Cardinal Ferdinando de' Medici, who stood to inherit and who moved remarkably quickly to consolidate power after their deaths. Forensic analysis of Francesco's remains, conducted in 2006, found elevated levels of arsenic and antimony, both classic Renaissance-era poisons. The Medici family also operated in a court culture where the specific knowledge of what substances did to human bodies was not mysterious or esoteric. Apothecaries and herbalists maintained the technical knowledge. Physicians who served at court understood the mechanisms, even if the theoretical framework of germ theory and toxicology was centuries away. The practical understanding of which plants and which mineral compounds produced, which effects, at which doses, over which time frames was available to people who had the money and connections to seek it out. And the Medici, as bankers, had both. The conspiracy here is not a single plot, but a pattern. The Medici and their circle operated in a world where poisoning was an accepted, if officially unacknowledged, method of political management. When someone became inconvenient, when an heir was in the wrong order, when a spouse's infidelity became a political liability, when a rival needed to be removed without the scandal of obvious violence, the answer was often a carefully prepared meal or a discreetly doctored cup of wine. That this happened is no longer seriously disputed by historians who specialize in the period. The forensic evidence from the tombs has moved several of these cases from the realm of rumor into something approaching documented fact. The Medici, those great patrons of beauty and art and humanism, were also operating a quiet parallel enterprise that was considerably less beautiful, and they were remarkably good at it. Chapter 5. The Papal Conspiracy of the Borgias. If the Medici represent one face of Renaissance conspiracy, the Borgia family represents something considerably more theatrical. The Borgias have a reputation that borders on legend. Poisoners, schemers, a father and son duo, Pope Alexander VI, and Cesare Borgia, who between them managed to turn the papacy into something that would make a modern corruption investigator's eye twitch. And while some of the Borgia mythology has been embellished over centuries of retelling, the core of it is historically verified to a degree that is genuinely startling. Alexander VI, born Rodrigo de Borja in Spain, became Pope in 1492 under circumstances that contemporary observers considered conspicuous, even by the standards of the papal conclave, a process that had never been famous for its spiritual purity. Multiple cardinals who later wrote or dictated their recollections indicated that Alexander's election had involved systematic bribery of other cardinals. 4 mule loads of silver, according to one account. Whether that number is precise or approximate, the principle is widely accepted. Alexander bought his papacy. Once installed, he proceeded to use the church as a vehicle for the advancement of his family with an energy and shamelessness that shocked even a church that had seen considerable shamelessness. He had several illegitimate children before becoming pope, which was not itself unusual for a Renaissance cardinal, and continued the relevant lifestyle afterward. He appointed family members, including his son Cesare, to ecclesiastical offices regardless of their fitness for those offices. He waged wars, made and broke alliances with the Italian city-states, and accumulated wealth for the papacy and the Borgia family simultaneously through methods that critics of the time described as simony at best and extortion at worst. The conspiracy allegations that follow the Borgias most tenaciously involve death, specifically the suspicious deaths of a remarkable number of wealthy cardinals and noblemen during Alexander's pontificate, deaths that were routinely followed by the confiscation of the deceased's estates and assets by the papal treasury, that is, by Alexander. The most famous alleged Borgia poisoning method was a substance referred to in contemporary sources variously as cantarella or simply as the powder. Contemporary diarists describe a highly toxic preparation that the Borgias supposedly kept in a small golden box to be administered when the situation called for it. Whether this specific preparation existed exactly as described is impossible to verify, but what is verifiable is that a statistically remarkable number of wealthy individuals who came into conflict with or close proximity to the Borgias died suddenly of mysterious fevers at moments that were conspicuously convenient for Borgia interests. Cardinal Orsini died in prison in 1503, shortly after his arrest and the confiscation of his considerable assets. He was in good health when arrested. The pattern, arrest wealthy cardinal, confiscate assets, watch cardinal die in custody, was repeated often enough that contemporary observers noted it explicitly. Cesare Borgia, Alexander's son, operated as the military and political arm of the family enterprise. He had his own brother, Juan Borgia, assassinated in 1497, dumped in the Tiber River with 5 stab wounds. This was not a matter of historical debate. Cesare himself more or less acknowledged responsibility in subsequent years, and contemporary witnesses placed him as the last person to be seen with Juan. The murder of one's own brother over a political rivalry, committed with the apparent, if horrified, acquiescence of the Pope, says something about the operating standards of the Borgia household. The grand irony of the Borgia story came in August 1503, when both Alexander VI and Cesare fell gravely ill after dining with Cardinal Adriano Castellesi. Alexander died. Cesare survived but was severely weakened. The immediate and almost universal assumption among contemporaries, among Roman gossips, among diplomats whose dispatches home described the events in vivid terms, was that the Borgias had been poisoned with their own methods at their own dinner table. The theory, still debated by historians, is that the Borgias had intended to poison Castellesi and instead, through some mishap of preparation or serving, had consumed the poison themselves, or that Castellesi had anticipated the attempt and arranged something of his own, or that it was simply a fever, as malaria was genuinely rampant in Rome that summer, and the timing was coincidence. Modern analysis of Alexander's recorded symptoms, drawn from contemporary accounts, is consistent with both severe malaria and certain types of poisoning. We cannot know for certain. But what we can say with confidence is this. The Borgias conspired systematically to use the power of the papacy for personal enrichment, arranged the elimination of rivals and obstacles through means that ranged from political manoeuvring to murder, and operated with a brazenness that their contemporaries found simultaneously terrifying and almost admirably bold. The papacy survived the Borgias, and the Church went through significant periods of reform in the following century. But the Borgia years left a mark. They demonstrated, with almost experimental clarity, how thoroughly a powerful institution could be corrupted when a sufficiently determined family decided to treat it as their personal vehicle. That's not a conspiracy theory, that's documented history. Chapter 6. The Peasants' Revolt and the King's Broken Promise. Not all medieval conspiracies were hatched in palace rooms by men with titles and poison. Some of the most consequential plots involved the people who had the least power and the most to lose. And some of the most revealing conspiracies were not plots to seize power, but systematic deceptions used by power to suppress those who dared challenge it. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 is a remarkable story on multiple levels. It's remarkable because it happened at all, a mass uprising by agricultural labourers and working people that briefly terrified the English nobility and brought a teenage king face to face with thousands of armed rebels at the gates of his own city. It's remarkable because the rebels articulated a genuine political philosophy demanding the abolition of serfdom, the removal of corrupt advisors, and accountability from the ruling class. And it's remarkable for how it ended with a royal promise made in public, apparently in good faith, and then broken the moment it was no longer convenient. The background requires a moment of attention. By 1381, English peasants had been suffering under compounding pressures for decades. The Black Death had killed roughly a third of the population in the mid-14th century, which had initially given surviving labourers significant leverage, since labour was suddenly scarce and valuable. Landowners had responded by trying to legally cap wages and restrict the movement of serfs, the Statute of Labourers of 1351 being the most obvious example. Then came the poll taxes, 3 of them in quick succession in the late 1370s and early 1380s, flat-rate taxes that fell disproportionately on the poor and were collected with enthusiastic brutality. By June 1381, the southeast of England was in open revolt. The rebels, led by figures including Wat Tyler from Kent and the radical priest John Bull, were not simply a hungry mob. They were organised, they had demands, and they were making their way to London with remarkable discipline. They burned legal records, targeted specifically those documents that recorded serfdom and financial obligations. They understood that the paper was the chains. Destroy the records, and the legal basis for servitude was weakened. King Richard II, 14 years old, agreed to meet the rebels. On June 14th at Mile End, he appeared before the assembled thousands and made promises that were by any measure extraordinary for a medieval king. He agreed to the abolition of serfdom. He agreed to a fixed rent rate. He agreed that all men would be free. The rebels, many of them, took him at his word and began to disperse. But a significant faction under Wat Tyler pushed for a second meeting at Smithfield. On June 15th, Tyler apparently demanded even more radical reforms. During the heated negotiations, an altercation broke out. The precise details are disputed, accounts differ on who provoked whom, but the outcome was not disputed at all. Wat Tyler was stabbed by the Lord Mayor of London, William Woolworth, in front of the assembled crowd. He died shortly afterward. Richard rode forward and told the milling, shocked rebels that he would be their leader now. It was an extraordinary piece of improvised theatre. The crowd, leaderless and uncertain, did not attack. They were guided away. The immediate crisis passed. And then the promises were broken. Systematically and without apparent guilt. By the end of June, royal forces were moving through the rebel counties with considerable violence. By July, leaders of the revolt were being hanged. By the end of 1381, every concession Richard had made at Mile End had been revoked. The abolition of serfdom was declared legally void. The men who had travelled to London on the basis of royal promises were told, in effect, that promises made under duress carried no weight. "Villains ye are," Richard is reported to have said, "and villains ye shall remain." Was this a conspiracy? In the strict sense, yes. The royal promises were made not in good faith, but as a tactical manoeuvre to disperse an immediate threat. The intent was never to implement them. The moment the rebels dispersed, the intention all along was to restore order and punish rebellion. The promises were a lie designed to accomplish a military objective without battle, and they worked exactly as intended. Contemporary chroniclers who were sympathetic to the crown justified this as appropriate statecraft. You don't negotiate with rebels. You pacify them. The lie was not a lie. It was a strategy. But from the perspective of the thousands who took the king at his word and walked home believing that their lives were about to change, the conspiracy was devastating in its simplicity. They trusted power. Power used that trust to neutralize them, and then power returned to exactly what it had been before. The deeper tragedy of the Peasants' Revolt is what it tells us about the asymmetry of medieval conspiracy. The king had the resources to make promises he never intended to keep. He had the legal and military power to revoke those promises the moment they were no longer tactically necessary. The rebels had walked to London with extraordinary courage, articulated genuine political demands, and for a brief extraordinary moment forced a king to meet them face to face and speak to them as if their lives and their dignity mattered. And then they walked home, and within weeks the machinery of royal authority was moving against them with every tool at its disposal. Wat Tyler's death at Smithfield was not, as it is sometimes presented, a simple confrontation that got out of hand. The Lord Mayor of London was there with weapons in the presence of the king at a negotiation. The circumstances have the smell of a trap, or at minimum an opportunity that was recognised and taken with considerable speed. Whether Tyler provoked the confrontation, or whether the confrontation was provoked for him, the result was the same. The movement's most visible leader was eliminated at the moment of maximum apparent success, and the rebellion dissolved almost immediately afterward. The men who hanged for the revolt in the months that followed were not the men who had made the promises. The men who made the promises were still on their thrones and in their manors, administering justice with the serene confidence of people who had never doubted that justice meant theirs. Chapter 7. The Black Death and the Scapegoating of the Jews. This chapter concerns a conspiracy that operated not in the darkness of a single court, or the shadows behind a single throne, but across an entire continent, driven by fear and enabled by authority. It is one of the most disturbing chapters in medieval history, and the conspiracy is not about what caused the Black Death. The conspiracy is about what powerful people chose to say caused it, and what they then permitted, encouraged, and in some cases, organised as a result. The Black Death arrived in Europe from Central Asia in the late 1340s. It was carried by fleas on rats along trade routes, and it killed with a terrible efficiency that medieval medicine was entirely unprepared to understand. Estimates of the mortality range from a third to half of Europe's entire population, depending on the region. In some cities, the dead were so numerous that they were simply pushed into mass graves. The social fabric of towns and villages unravelled. Priests died alongside parishioners. Doctors died alongside patients. The scale of suffering was beyond any framework available to the medieval mind. People needed an explanation, and the explanation that spread almost as rapidly as the plague itself, through rumour, through sermon, through official proclamation, was this: the Jews had poisoned the wells. It was not true. It was not remotely true. The Black Death was a bacteriological catastrophe with no human agent. But the conspiracy theory served a purpose, and it spread with terrifying speed across Europe. Beginning in 1348, Jews were accused of deliberately introducing plague into Christian communities by contaminating water sources with a mysterious poison. Confessions were obtained, again through methods that produced whatever confession the interrogator sought. Communities across Germany, France, Switzerland and Spain acted on these accusations. The result was a wave of pogroms, organized massacres of Jewish communities that constitute one of the worst episodes of systematic violence in medieval European history. In Strasbourg, in February 1349, roughly 2,000 Jews were burned alive when the local population and their authorities decided the conspiracy was proven. In Mainz, in Frankfurt, in Cologne, in dozens of towns across the Rhineland, Jewish communities were attacked, expelled or annihilated. The estimated death toll from these pogroms numbers in the tens of thousands. Pope Clement VI issued a papal bull in 1348 stating explicitly that the plague showed no preference for Jews over Christians, that Jews were dying from the plague at the same rates as everyone else, and that therefore the well poisoning theory was absurd. He forbade violence against Jews on this basis. The bull was largely ignored in the areas where the violence was most intense. Here is where the conspiracy becomes most clearly a conspiracy in the organized, deliberate sense. Local authorities in several cities were well aware that the accusations were false or at least unproven, and yet they participated in or permitted the violence because it was useful. Jewish communities held debts from Christian citizens. Jewish property could be confiscated by authorities after attacks. The elimination of Jewish communities solved several financial problems simultaneously for certain civic leaders. In Strasbourg, the massacre occurred after a political faction that wanted the Jews' property explicitly took control of the city council and overrode the opposition of the previous administration, which had been protecting the Jewish community. This was not spontaneous mob violence. This was orchestrated. A political faction seized power, publicly endorsed the well-poisoning theory, and then organized the subsequent violence. The conspiracy theory was the instrument. The property was the goal. The well-poisoning accusations against Jews during the Black Death represent a case study in how false conspiracy theories can be weaponized by those in power to accomplish objectives they cannot pursue openly. And the people who spread and enforced these theories knew, on some level, that they were false. Clement VI knew they were false. The Strasbourg faction that seized power knew, because they had access to the same observations Clement did, that Jews were dying of plague at similar rates to everyone else. They proceeded anyway, because the conspiracy theory was useful, and because in a world paralyzed by fear, people who offered an explanation, however false, could harness enormous destructive energy. The well-poisoning accusations against Jews during the Black Death represent a case study in how false conspiracy theories can be weaponized by those in power to accomplish objectives they cannot pursue openly. And the people who spread and enforced these theories knew, on some level, that they were false. Clement VI knew they were false. The Strasbourg faction that seized power knew, because they had access to the same observations Clement did, that Jews were dying of plague at similar rates to everyone else. They proceeded anyway, because the conspiracy theory was useful, And because in a world paralysed by fear, people who offered an explanation, however false, could harness enormous destructive energy. The historical evidence for this is now extensive. We have the papal bull, we have the records of the Strasbourg political transition, we have the documentary evidence of debts that were conveniently cancelled by the deaths of Jewish creditors. We have the testimonies, such as they are, of survivors who described organised rather than spontaneous violence. The conspiracy to use false accusations as a cover for organised persecution is one of the most thoroughly documented atrocities of the medieval period. It is also worth spending a moment on the psychology of how the conspiracy worked at the ground level, among ordinary people who weren't calculating financial advantages and weren't in the Strasbourg council chamber making political decisions. For most of the people who participated in or permitted the violence, the well-poisoning theory was simply believed, and that belief was not entirely irrational given what they knew and didn't know about disease transmission. Medieval people had no concept of germ theory. They had no understanding of how plague actually spread. They could observe that the disease seemed to move from place to place, and the idea of a deliberate agent introducing a poison into water supplies was, given their available framework for understanding the world, not obviously more absurd than any other explanation. What made the conspiracy so effective and so evil was exactly this. It took genuine human fear and genuine human ignorance and shaped it toward a predetermined target. The people orchestrating the pogrom in Strasbourg may have been cynically calculating. The people who showed up to participate were, many of them, genuinely terrified individuals doing what they had been told was necessary for survival. The manipulators and the manipulated existed in the same crowd, and from the outside they looked identical. That is how the most effective conspiracies always work. Chapter 8. The Conspiracy of the Star Chamber, England, in the late medieval and early Tudor period, had, among its many institutions, one that operated in almost deliberate defiance of the principles that were slowly emerging around due process and transparent justice. It met in a room decorated with gilded stars on a blue ceiling in the Palace of Westminster. It had no jury. Its proceedings were secret. Its records were not open to the public. It could summon anyone, compel testimony through means that were not gentle, and deliver verdicts that could not be appealed in the ordinary courts. It was called the Star Chamber. The official version of the Star Chamber's history presents it as a legitimate court developed to handle cases that ordinary courts couldn't manage, particularly those involving powerful nobles who could intimidate juries or corrupt local officials. And in its earliest form, under Henry VII and in the early years of Henry VIII, this characterization is not entirely wrong. The court did handle genuine cases involving riots, perjury, and abuses of power that the regular system couldn't address. But the Star Chamber is also the source of a very real and historically documented conspiracy against due process and political opponents, a conspiracy that became most visible under Charles I in the 17th century, but whose roots run deep into the Tudor period. The chamber was used systematically to suppress political dissent, to intimidate journalists and pamphleteers, to punish religious nonconformity, and to destroy the reputations and fortunes of those who displeased the crown or its close allies. The conspiracy was structural. By design, the Star Chamber removed the protections that ordinary courts offered. No jury meant that the verdict was entirely in the hands of judges who served at royal pleasure. Secret proceedings meant that the accused could not prepare an adequate defense because they didn't know what evidence existed against them or who had testified. The ability to compel testimony meant that witnesses could be coerced into saying whatever was needed. William Prynne is one of the most documented victims of the Star Chamber's conspiratorial operation. A barrister and pamphleteer, Prynne published a denunciation of theatrical performances in 1632, which was interpreted as an attack on Queen Henrietta Maria, who had recently appeared in a court masque. He was brought before the Star Chamber, found guilty, fined enormously, disbarred, sentenced to have his ears cropped, and imprisoned indefinitely. He later published from prison, was brought back, had the stumps of his ears further mutilated, and was branded on both cheeks with the letters SL for seditious libeller. His case was not exceptional. It was emblematic of a systematic pattern. The Star Chamber had been turned into an instrument of political persecution dressed in the language of justice. The secret proceedings, the absence of jury, the ability to impose corporal punishments at a level that regular courts could not, all of these features were used deliberately to ensure that the court could reach predetermined verdicts and impose exemplary punishments on anyone the Crown wished to silence. The conspiracy was eventually exposed and dismantled. In 1641, the Long Parliament abolished the Star Chamber as part of a broader constitutional confrontation with Charles I that would eventually lead to civil war. The abolition was explicitly justified in terms of the court's abuse of process, its use as an instrument of arbitrary royal power, and its systematic denial of the rights of Englishmen. The MPs who voted to abolish it were naming something real. The court had been a conspiracy against justice masquerading as justice itself, and the name lived on. Star Chamber became, and remains today, a byword for secret, arbitrary, and unjust proceedings. The fact that we still use the phrase tells you something about how deeply the memory of the conspiracy sank into the collective consciousness of English political culture. It's worth noting that the Star Chamber's method of operating has proven remarkably persistent as a model, even after the chamber itself was abolished. The combination of elements that made the Star Chamber effective as an instrument of political suppression, secret proceedings, predetermined conclusions, the removal of ordinary legal protections, punishment designed to be exemplary and humiliating, didn't vanish with the chamber itself. Regimes throughout subsequent centuries have rediscovered the same toolkit and implemented variations of it. The specific institution died. The template proved unfortunately durable. What the Star Chamber's abolition did establish, importantly, was the principle that such institutions were illegitimate. The Long Parliament didn't just abolish the chamber on pragmatic grounds. They articulated, at least implicitly, a principle that justice required transparency, that the accused had rights that could not simply be stripped away by royal prerogative, that proceedings conducted in secret and without jury were not justice at all, but its opposite. Those principles were imperfectly applied and repeatedly violated in subsequent English and British history. But they had been named, and naming something as a violation of principle is, historically, the first step toward making the violation less acceptable over time. Chapter 9. The Conspiracy of the Wool Trade, Edward III and England's Secret Economic War. Not every medieval conspiracy was played out with daggers and poison. Some of the most consequential plots in the medieval world were economic in nature. Battles fought not with swords but with wool, debt, and carefully managed misinformation. And few economic conspiracies of the era are more revealing or more thoroughly documented by subsequent historians than the systematic campaign waged by Edward III of England to manipulate the European wool market, destabilise the banking families of Florence, and finance a major war through what can only be described as deliberate financial fraud. The background requires a brief detour into medieval economics. Wool was, for much of the medieval period, England's most valuable export. English wool, especially the fine, long staple wool from the English Midlands, was essential to the textile industries of the great Flemish and Italian cities. Florence, Bruges, Ghent, and a dozen other centres of cloth production depended on English wool to keep their looms running and their workers employed. This gave the English crown an extraordinary piece of leverage, control over a commodity that the most powerful commercial cities in Europe could not do without. Edward III inherited this leverage, and he used it with a sophistication that his contemporaries, including his victims, did not fully grasp until it was too late. In the 1330s, facing the enormous costs of what would become the 100 Years' War against France, Edward needed money, vast amounts of it, more than England's own revenues could provide. He needed loans. He went to the great Florentine banking houses. The Bardi and the Peruzzi families were the dominant financial institutions of 14th century Europe. Between them, they had banking operations across the continent, handling the finances of popes, kings, and merchants with an efficiency that would be recognizable to any modern banker. They were immensely wealthy. They were also accustomed to lending to kings, who were the safest and most prestigious class of borrower, because in theory, a king had the taxing power of an entire kingdom behind him. Edward III borrowed enormous sums from the Bardi and the Peruzzi through the 1330s, using a combination of cash loans and credit arrangements that tied the loans to guaranteed deliveries of English wool at favourable prices. The wool would serve as effective collateral, since it could be sold on the continental market to recover the loan's value. It was a sophisticated arrangement, and it suited both parties for a while. The conspiracy began to take shape when Edward's military ambitions outpaced even his considerable capacity for borrowing. The 100 Years' War was enormously expensive, and the early campaigns did not produce the rapid English victories that might have made the debts manageable. Edward needed more credit. He also needed to keep his existing creditors confident enough not to call in their loans all at once, which would have been catastrophic. A picture of deliberate, organized deception. Edward made assurances about wool deliveries that he did not intend to keep. He arranged for information about the English wool crop and the Crown's financial position to be selectively and misleadingly presented to his Florentine creditors. He played the two banking houses against each other, using each one's anxiety about the other's exposure to extract fresh credit, that both parties might have refused if they had known the full picture. When Edward finally repudiated his debts to the Bardi and Peruzzi in the early 1340s, the effect was catastrophic. The two families had lent on a scale that left them fatally exposed. The Peruzzi collapsed first, in 1343. The Bardi followed in 1346. The bankruptcies sent shockwaves through the entire European credit system. The Florentine economy, which depended heavily on the foreign activities of its great banking families, contracted severely. Workers lost employment. Smaller businesses that had depended on Bardi and Peruzzi credit found it withdrawn overnight. Edward III, meanwhile, had extracted from the Florentine bankers everything he needed to launch the campaigns that produced the great English victory at Crécy in 1346. He had used their money, their credit, and ultimately their ruin as the financial foundation of his military success. And he did it through a conspiracy of misrepresentation, selective disclosure, and deliberate management of his creditors' understanding of the risks they were taking. This is not a story about a reckless king who borrowed too much and couldn't pay it back. The records suggest a degree of planning and awareness that makes the outcome look much more deliberate than accidental. Edward knew at some point that he was never going to repay these loans in full. He borrowed anyway, bought the military outcome he needed, and then let the consequences fall on Florence. The Florentines eventually figured out what had happened to them, but by then there was nothing to be done. You don't sue the King of England in a 14th century court and expect satisfaction. The conspiracy worked. The Bardi and Peruzzi paid for the 100 Years' War with their institutions' lives, and Edward III won his battle. Chapter 11. The Hidden Hand of Venice. La Serenissimi's secret state. If you wanted to study medieval and Renaissance-era conspiracy in its most sophisticated, most systematic, and most durably effective form, you would spend considerable time in Venice, because Venice didn't just tolerate conspiracy. Venice institutionalized it. Venice built an entire apparatus of intelligence, surveillance, and covert political action that was so effective it served as a model for state security organizations for centuries afterward. The Republic of Venice, La Serenissima, the most serene, lasted over 1,000 years, from the late 7th century to its fall to Napoleon in 1797. During that millennium, it developed a system of governance that was remarkable in many ways, genuinely republican in its structure, collectively governed by a complex interlocking system of councils and committees designed specifically to prevent any one person from accumulating too much power. But embedded within that system was something darker and more remarkable still: the Council of Ten. Established in 1310 in response to an attempted coup by a nobleman named Bahamonte Tiepolo, the Council of Ten was initially a temporary security measure, a small body with emergency powers to investigate and prosecute threats to the Republic. It became permanent, and over the following centuries it evolved into something unprecedented in the medieval world, a standing state intelligence and security organization with sweeping powers to investigate, arrest, try in secret, and punish anyone it deemed a threat to the Republic. The Council operated through a network of informants so extensive that it transformed ordinary Venetian social life. Anonymous accusation boxes called Bocce di Leone, lions' mouths, were installed throughout the city. Citizens could deposit written accusations against their neighbours, their employers, even their family members, without signing their names. The council would investigate. The accused would not know who had accused them. The proceedings would be secret. The verdict would be final. This was not occasional. This was systematic. The lions' mouths were genuinely used regularly by Venetians who had grudges to settle, fears to report, or rivals to neutralize. And the council, to its credit, didn't simply accept every anonymous accusation as fact. It had investigative procedures. It required corroboration, and accusations that couldn't be substantiated were dismissed. But the existence of the system, the knowledge that anyone might have accused you, that agents of the council might be watching, shaped behavior in ways that went far beyond the cases that were actually prosecuted. The Council of Ten also operated abroad. Venice had one of the most sophisticated diplomatic intelligence networks in Europe. Its ambassadors, called baili, were required to file detailed reports home about the political situation in every city they served, the personalities of the rulers, their weaknesses, their ambitions, their advisors' loyalties. These reports, the relazioni, form one of the most extraordinary archives of political intelligence from the medieval and Renaissance periods. They were secret at the time of writing. They were meant for the council's eyes only. Venice also employed what we would today recognize as covert operatives, agents who travelled undercover, who reported on threats to Venetian commercial interests, who identified political opportunities, and who were occasionally tasked with more direct interventions. The Council of Ten authorized assassinations, not frequently and not casually, but the records contain enough examples to establish that state-sponsored targeted elimination of threats to the Republic was an accepted tool of Venetian policy. The most famous such authorization came in the case of a plot against the Republic itself. In 1415, the Council of Ten offered a reward for the capture or elimination of a man who had been providing intelligence about Venetian naval operations to enemies of the state. The offer was accepted. The man was eliminated. The council recorded the transaction in its minutes with characteristic Venetian efficiency, the service, the payment, and the notation that the matter was closed. For centuries, the full extent of Venice's secret operations was known only to the council and its operatives. What the public knew was the Republic's polished official surface, the ceremonies, the gorgeous Gothic and Byzantine architecture, the commercial acumen, the reputation for stability and sophisticated governance. The machinery running quietly beneath that surface was almost entirely invisible. It wasn't until historians began systematically working through the Venetian state archives in the 19th and 20th centuries that the full picture emerged. The Venetian Republic had maintained a functioning secret state within the Republic for most of its existence. The surveillance, the intelligence network, the covert operations, the secret trials, all of it documented in the meticulous Venetian administrative style, filed, catalogued and preserved. The conspiracy was real. The Republic's serenity was, in significant part, purchased and maintained by mechanisms that the general public was never meant to know about. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about Venice's secret apparatus is how long it worked. The Republic survived for over 1,000 years in one of the most politically turbulent regions of the world. It outlasted the Byzantine Empire, the various Italian signori, the medieval papacy as a temporal power, and multiple waves of Ottoman expansion. Its survival was partly geographic, partly commercial, and partly the result of that sophisticated intelligence operation that allowed it to identify threats, neutralize enemies, and manage information with extraordinary precision. The lions' mouths of Venice did not collect conspiracy theories. They collected information that was then investigated by a rigorous, if secret, process. The Council of Ten, for all its frightening extrajudicial power, operated according to rules and procedures that were internally consistent. Accusations without evidence were dismissed. Double informants were identified and managed. The system's efficiency came not from chaos, but from its opposite, a cold, calm, carefully maintained machinery that processed information and produced outcomes with bureaucratic consistency, which is perhaps the most unsettling thing about it. The Venetian secret state was not the product of a single tyrant's paranoia. It was the product of an institution. It was built by committee, maintained by committee, and dismantled by no one during the Republic's long life because it worked, and the people it worked for had no reason to stop it. The conspiracy of Venice was not a secret plot. It was a secret system, and systems are much harder to overthrow than plots. Chapter 10. The Conspiracy Behind the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta, Great Charter, one of the foundational documents of what would eventually become democratic governance. School children are taught that it was a milestone in the story of human rights, the moment when an English king was compelled to acknowledge that even royal power had limits, and all of that is broadly true. But the story of how the Magna Carta came to exist, and what happened to it almost immediately after it was sealed, is a story of conspiracy so tangled and fascinating that it deserves far more attention than it typically receives. Start with King John of England. John is one of history's most comprehensively unsuccessful monarchs. He lost the English crown's possessions in Normandy to the French. He quarrelled with Pope Innocent III so severely that England was placed under interdict, meaning no church services could be performed for years. He taxed his barons with a ferocity and creativity that made him deeply unpopular among precisely the people whose military and political support he needed most. By 1215, his barons were in open rebellion. Here's where the conspiracy becomes interesting. The barons who compelled John to seal the Magna Carta at Runnymede in June 1215 were not, primarily, acting from principle. They were acting from self-interest, which is not a criticism. Self-interest is a reliable motivator, and in this case it aligned well with principles that turned out to be genuinely important. But the document they extracted from John was primarily a list of protections for their specific interests as magnates. their rights of inheritance, their freedom from arbitrary imprisonment, their ability to be judged by their peers, their financial dealings with the Crown. Clause 39, the one that eventually echoes through the centuries as the foundation of due process. No free man shall be seized or imprisoned, except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land, was not in the Magna Carta because the barons cared about the rights of all free men. It was there because they cared about their own rights as great lords, and they expressed those rights in terms general enough to be subsequently read as applying more broadly. Now for the conspiracy. John sealed the Magna Carta on June 15th, 1215. Within 10 weeks he had sent an appeal to Pope Innocent III, asking the Pope to annul the document on the grounds that it had been extracted under duress and that it compromised royal authority and papal feudal rights, John having made England a papal fief a couple of years earlier as part of resolving his quarrel with Rome. Innocent III, who had his own reasons for wanting a strong English monarchy, and who had legitimate theological objections to what the barons had done, agreed. In August 1215 the Pope issued a papal bull declaring the Magna Carta null and void, of no validity or effect forever, and excommunicating the barons who had forced it. This was always the plan. John never intended to honour the Magna Carta for a moment longer than necessary. The negotiations at Runnymede were a tactical retreat, a way to buy time while he sent ambassadors to Rome and began hiring mercenaries. Within months, the two sides were at war again, the First Barons' War. John died in 1216, still fighting, and the Magna Carta that we venerate today was actually reissued multiple times in subsequent years by the regents of his 9-year-old successor, Henry III, as a political tool to win over the rebel barons. The document's survival and eventual significance were almost accidental, certainly not what John intended. The conspiracy is layered here. John conspired to accept a document he had no intention of keeping. The barons conspired to force a document on the king that was primarily designed to protect their own privileges. The Pope conspired to annul an emerging constitutional principle because it conflicted with his own view of royal prerogative and papal authority. And then history conspired against all of them, preserving and eventually elevating a document that none of its original parties intended or understood in quite the terms that later centuries would read into it. The Magna Carta became genuinely important, not because of what any of the 1215 conspirators intended, but because later generations found in it a framework they could use. The document took on a life beyond its origins. The conspiracy that produced it was petty and self-interested. The document it produced became something else entirely. History is strange that way. What's remarkable about the Magna Carta's survival is how many more conspiracies it had to survive after 1215. Henry III's long minority meant the document was reissued multiple times by different sets of regent administrators, each of whom was using it for their own political purposes. Edward I reissued it and confirmed it in exchange for parliamentary grants of taxation. Simon de Montfort's rebellion in the 1260s invoked it as justification. Each invocation added a layer of meaning. Each time a powerful person found it useful to cite the Magna Carta, the document became slightly more real, slightly more settled into the political landscape. The original conspirators, John and the barons of 1215, would have been baffled by what their self-interested squabble eventually became. John tried to destroy it. The barons tried to use it only for themselves. The Pope tried to annul it, and yet all of them failed in the long run, because the document described something real, the idea that power should be constrained, that those who hold authority owe those they govern some account of how it is used. That idea proved far more durable than any of the specific interests of the men who first put words to it. The lesson for our purposes is this: Conspiracies operate in the short term. History operates in the long term. And in the long term, what matters is not what the conspirators intended, but what they put into motion. The Magna Carta was born of a conspiracy and survived through a series of further conspiracies. It became, despite all of that and because of all of that, something its authors never imagined. Chapter 11. The Conspiracy of Silence Around the Church's Financial Empire. Here is a conspiracy that lasted not for years or decades, but for centuries, sustained not by a handful of plotters in a dark room, but by the institutional interests of one of the most powerful organizations in human history. The conspiracy was this: the medieval church accumulated staggering wealth through methods it publicly denounced, maintained that wealth through accounting practices it never disclosed, and suppressed criticism of those methods with tools that ranged from excommunication to execution. Let's be precise about what the church officially taught. The church taught that usury, the lending of money for interest, was a sin. This was not a minor ruling. It was a central moral teaching, derived from biblical injunctions and elaborated by centuries of theological argument. To charge interest on a loan was to profit from time itself, and time belonged to God. It was, accordingly, deeply wrong. Bankers who practiced usury were subject to ecclesiastical censure. Moneylenders were, in theory, excluded from communion, from Christian burial, from the full sacramental life of the church. Meanwhile, the church needed money, enormous amounts of money, to build cathedrals that took centuries, to maintain monasteries and their libraries and their hospitals, to fund the Crusades, to support the administrative apparatus of the papacy, which by the 12th century was a sophisticated bureaucracy managing an organization that spanned a continent, to pay armies sometimes when the political situation required it. Where did this money come from? Tithes, certainly. Donations, certainly. The sale of indulgences, certainly. But also, and this is where the conspiracy of silence becomes most interesting, from financial instruments and arrangements that were, functionally, forms of lending at interest, dressed in language that technically avoided the prohibition. The triple contract, the bill of exchange, the census, the rent charge. These were financial instruments developed in and around the medieval church, often by monasteries and bishops who needed to manage large land holdings and cash flows that accomplished the economic function of interest-bearing loans while being structured in ways that could be defended as technically not usurious. The church's canon lawyers were extraordinarily creative in developing these distinctions. Beyond the technical financial innovations, there was a more straightforward arrangement. The church borrowed money from exactly the kind of bankers it publicly condemned, and it paid those bankers back with exactly the kind of profit it publicly denounced. The Medici Bank, to return to that family briefly, did enormous amounts of business with the papacy. The relationship was symbiotic and open to anyone who looked closely, but it was never officially acknowledged as the interest-bearing banking relationship it clearly was. The conspiracy of silence extended to the church's land holdings and their acquisition. Through bequests from dying Christians who wanted to secure prayers for their souls, through political gifts from rulers seeking ecclesiastical support, and through outright purchase, the church accumulated land across Europe on a scale that in some regions amounted to a third or more of all arable territory. This land generated revenue. The revenue funded operations. The operations reinforced power. The power enabled the accumulation of more land. And who kept this arrangement invisible? Everyone with a stake in it. The local bishop, who was living comfortably on the rents from church properties, had no interest in a theological discussion, about whether his institution was too wealthy. The cardinal who oversaw the banking relationships with the Medici had no interest in a public audit. The theologians who might have challenged the financial arrangements were often dependent on church patronage for their positions and their libraries. It is also worth pausing to consider the scale of what the church's financial apparatus actually meant in practice for the people living within it. If you were a medieval peasant, the church was in some sense inescapable. It took your tithe, 10% of your income, with the force of both divine command and civil law behind the collection. It charged fees for sacraments at every major moment of life: baptism, marriage, burial. It sold indulgences, which were remissions of the time your soul would spend in purgatory, at prices calibrated to what the market would bear, which in times of anxiety and plague could be considerable. It charged for the saying of masses for deceased relatives. It maintained a grip on the entire spiritual economy of medieval life, and that spiritual economy was never entirely separate from the material economy. The men at the top of this system, the bishops, the abbots, the cardinals, the popes, lived in material conditions that bore no resemblance to the apostolic poverty they officially venerated. Bishops' palaces were architectural monuments. Cardinal households maintained dozens of servants. Popes rode in procession through Rome on white horses with gold trappings, while the city around them hosted some of the worst urban poverty in Europe. The gap between the institution's official theology and its actual operation was visible, undeniable, and commented on by critics across the medieval period. It took the shock of the Reformation, Martin Luther's 95 Theses in 1517, being the most dramatic moment in a longer process, to bring these contradictions into public discussion. Luther's critiques were specifically aimed at the financial practices of the Church, at the sale of indulgences as a monetization of salvation, at the gap between official poverty and institutional wealth, at the financial corruption that he and other reformers saw as flowing directly from the Church's wealth and power. When the reformers pried open the books, what they found, and what subsequent historians have documented extensively, confirmed that the conspiracy of silence had been hiding an enormous financial apparatus that bore little resemblance to the institution's official self-description. The wealth was real, the financial arrangements were real, the silence was deliberate, and the mechanisms used to enforce that silence, the authority to excommunicate critics, the ability to brand persistent questioners as heretics, the general climate in which attacking the Church's financial practices could have extremely unpleasant consequences were all real. This was conspiracy at institutional scale, maintained not by individual plotters, but by the shared interest of thousands of people in a very comfortable status quo. Chapter 12. The Conspirators Who Changed the World, Gutenberg and the Scribes. Let's end with a conspiracy of a different kind, not a conspiracy of kings or popes or poisoners, a conspiracy of technology, economics and professional self-interest. A conspiracy that tried to stop one of the most consequential inventions in human history, and that failed so completely that it changed the world. Johannes Gutenberg developed his movable type printing press around 1440 in Mainz and printed his famous Bible in the early 1450s. The technology he developed, building on existing innovations in metallurgy and oil-based ink, made it possible to produce books at a speed and cost that was revolutionary. A single skilled printer with a press could produce more copies of a text in a week than a scriptorium of monks could produce in months. The people who had the most to lose from this development were precisely the people who should have seen it coming: the professional scribes, the monasteries that operated scriptoria, the manuscript traders, and the universities that had built entire supply chains around the laborious, expensive, status-conferring production of handwritten books. Knowledge was expensive specifically because books were expensive, and books were expensive because producing them required enormous amounts of skilled human labour. Control over book production was, in effect, control over which ideas spread and which didn't. The early reactions to Gutenberg's press were not merely competitive anxiety. They were organised opposition dressed in various justifications. In some ecclesiastical circles, printing was viewed with theological suspicion as a potential vehicle for heresy, since it would inevitably make it harder to control which texts circulated and who had access to them. This wasn't wrong. Within decades, Luther would use printing to distribute his theses across Europe in ways that were completely outside the Church's ability to suppress. In several cities, existing guilds and professional associations attempted to restrict or tax printing operations in ways that would protect established manuscript production. The guilds had legal standing and political connections, and they used both. In some cases, early printers found their operations challenged by authorities whose sympathies lay with the established manuscript trade. There was also a more subtle conspiracy: the deliberate conflation of printed books with inferior, vulgar products compared to the prestige of handwritten manuscripts. For a generation, printed books were looked down upon by scholars and aristocrats who associated them with mass production and populism. Hand-copied manuscripts remained status objects in ways that printed books were not. This was partly genuine aesthetic preference, partly a coordinated campaign by those invested in manuscript culture to frame the new technology as beneath serious intellectual consideration. None of it worked. The economics were too overwhelming. The utility was too obvious. Within 50 years of Gutenberg's Bible, presses had been established across Europe. Within a century, the manuscript trade as a dominant cultural institution was effectively dead. The conspiracy of professional interests that had tried to slow or limit printing was swept away by the technology's obvious advantages. But what makes this a conspiracy confirmed, rather than merely suspected, is the documentary evidence from guild records, from church archives, and from the legal and financial records of early printing houses, showing coordinated resistance to the technology from established interests. The suppression attempts were real, the motives were clear, and the ultimate failure of those attempts tells us something important. Conspiracy, even when organised and resourced and backed by powerful institutional interests, cannot ultimately hold back something that serves enough people's interests more effectively than the existing arrangement. The scribes conspired against the printers won, and the world that the printers built, a world of literate populations, affordable books, and ideas moving faster than authority could track them, gave rise directly to the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, and eventually everything that followed. The conspiracy failed, but its failure was as consequential as any of the conspiracies that succeeded. And there is something poetically appropriate about this. The conspiracies that succeeded, Philip destroying the Templars, Richard using a broken promise to crush the peasants' revolt, the Borgia family running the papacy as a personal enterprise, all of them worked in the short term precisely because they operated in the dark. Secrecy was their oxygen. The moment light reached them, they began to die. Gutenberg's press was, among everything else it was, a machine for introducing light. Not immediately, not uniformly, not without producing its own new forms of propaganda and manipulation. But the cumulative effect of cheap, reproducible text was an extraordinary redistribution of the power to know. Before the press, information was expensive and controlled. After the press, information became cheaper with each passing generation. The people who had controlled information, the church, the scriptoriums, the manuscript traders, the academic establishments, didn't disappear. But their monopoly on knowledge did. The scribes who tried to stop the press were not wrong about what it would do to them. It destroyed their professional world, more completely and more rapidly than even the most pessimistic of them could have predicted. Within 2 generations of Gutenberg, the manuscript trade, as a primary vehicle for knowledge distribution, was effectively over. What the scribes were wrong about was their ability to stop it, and they were wrong about that because they underestimated the force of distributed human demand. Millions of people wanted cheaper books. Millions of people wanted access to texts that had previously been available only to monasteries and wealthy nobles. The technology that could serve that demand was not going to be stopped by guild regulations and aesthetic snobbery. Conclusion: why the conspiracies were real and why it matters. Let's take a step back and consider what we've seen tonight. A king who arranged the murder of an archbishop and then performed public grief as a political strategy. A royal uncle who made 2 children disappear from the most secure facility in England. An entire military order dismantled through fabricated charges designed to cover the theft of their assets. A papal family that turned the church into a personal enrichment scheme and poisoned rivals with refined efficiency. A king who made promises he never intended to keep. An entire continent that weaponized a false conspiracy theory to cover organized persecution. A republic that built a secret state within its serene public face. A foundational legal document that was secretly invalidated within weeks of its creation. A church that preached against usury while running a sophisticated financial operation. And professional interests that conspired to stop a technology that ended up changing everything. These are not legends. These are not folk tales. These are documented, historically verified events that at some point were whispered about in exactly the way we dismiss modern conspiracy theories as paranoid fantasies, the overactive imaginations of people who couldn't accept that great institutions operated in good faith. They didn't, or at least not always, not even close to always. Think about what it would have felt like to be living inside any one of these conspiracies as an ordinary person at the time. To have heard in 1307 that the Knights Templar, those warrior monks who had fought in the Crusades and managed half of Europe's banking, were secretly devil worshippers who spat on the cross and worshipped a mysterious idol. The official story was being disseminated by the King of France, confirmed by extracted confessions endorsed by the papal court. Everyone official was telling the same story, and if you said, "This seems convenient for people who owe the Templars a lot of money," you were the conspiracy theorist. You were the one failing to accept the documented, institutional, authoritative account. Or imagine being a Florentine citizen in 1343, watching the Peruzzi banking house collapse, being told it was due to Edward III's debt repudiation, not understanding that the debts had been structured in a way that the English king had known from early on, could not be honoured. You'd have no access to the internal correspondence. You'd have no way of knowing what Edward's treasury officials had been saying to each other in private. You just saw the city's great financial institution fail, and people's lives falling apart as a result. The conspiracy had already worked before you could identify it as one. This is the condition of ordinary people throughout most of human history, in relation to the conspiracies that shaped their world. They were inside the effect without access to the cause. They experienced the outcome without understanding the mechanism. And anyone who pointed toward the mechanism was offering a theory that could not be proven because the proof was locked in archives, in private correspondence, in the conversations that powerful people had behind closed doors and never intended to be remembered. The lesson of medieval conspiracy is not that we should trust nothing and suspect everything. That path leads somewhere dark and unhelpful. The lesson is more nuanced and more important than that. Power Concentrated power especially has always tended towards self-preservation and self-serving behaviour. The medieval world was simply one in which the tools for holding power accountable were almost entirely absent. No free press, no independent judiciary, no democratic accountability, no transparency requirements, no freedom of information. The only check on what a king or pope or powerful family could do was the countervailing power of rivals, and rivals could usually be bought, intimidated, or poisoned. What changed, gradually and painfully and with considerable violence along the way, was the development of exactly those accountability mechanisms. The Magna Carta, even born of conspiracy and self-interest, planted a seed. Gutenberg's press, even resisted by the establishment, made it harder to suppress dissent. The Reformation, even chaotic and bloody, broke the Church's monopoly on religious authority, and eventually, indirectly, contributed to the development of religious tolerance and institutional pluralism. The conspiracies of the medieval world were real, and what makes them historically significant is not just that they happened, but that their exposure, their gradual unravelling before the slow advance of accountability and transparency, taught later generations something essential about the nature of power and the necessity of mechanisms to check it. The Middle Ages ended. The conspiracies continued as they always will. Power will always attempt to operate in the dark, to say one thing while doing another, to use official language to justify unofficial actions. What changed is that we developed better tools for finding and exposing those conspiracies, better archives, better journalism, better science, better historical method. The men who dragged Thomas Becket's body to the cathedral floor thought history wouldn't notice. The barons who dissolved the Templar Order thought the official record would serve as the final word. The Medici thought that a few discreet doses and a plausible story about fever would be the end of it. They were wrong. History notices. History asks questions. History doesn't accept the official explanation without looking for what's behind it. And sometimes, often enough to matter, history finds the truth. There is also a subtler lesson running through all of these stories that is worth naming explicitly before we close. Every single one of these conspiracies depended on information asymmetry. The conspirators knew something the public didn't. Philip IV knew the charges against the Templars were manufactured. Richard III knew what had happened to the princes. The Medici knew what was in the cup. The Venetian council knew who had been arrested and why. The king knew his promises were lies before the ink was dry. The moment that information became available to more people, the conspiracy's power diminished. Once enough, bishops had heard the Templar confessions and noted their inconsistencies. Doubt spread. Once the chroniclers had written down what they observed at Runnymede and Smithfield, the historical record became available for later scrutiny. Once the Venetian archives were open to researchers, the secret state became history. Information is the solvent of conspiracy, and the medieval world's greatest structural feature, its control of information by a tiny literate elite, was also conspiracy's greatest enabling condition. We live in a world with more information available to more people than at any previous point in human history. That has produced its own problems, its own forms of manipulation, its own weaponized false narratives that spread faster than any medieval rumor could have. The tools have changed, the underlying dynamics have not. Power still prefers to operate without scrutiny. Institutions still have interests they prefer to keep quiet. The gap between what powerful people say and what they do is not smaller than it was in the Middle Ages. We are simply better equipped to find it, and maybe that's the most important thing these medieval conspiracies can teach us. Not paranoia, but discernment. The ability to look at official accounts and ask what would make them true and what would make them false, and which set of circumstances fits the available evidence better. The barons in 1215 asked that question about John and found an answer. The historians who examined the Medici tombs asked it and found arsenic. The archivists who opened the Venetian state records asked it and found the Council of Ten's meticulous records of its covert operations. The parliamentary committees who questioned the Star Chamber's methods asked it and eventually found the will to abolish it. The medieval world was a world in which the powerful relied on ordinary people's inability to ask those questions, or their inability to find the answers even when they asked. Every improvement in human accountability, every archive opened, every legal protection established, every institution made transparent, has been a step away from the medieval condition and towards something better, not perfect, never perfect, but better. The people who whispered that Henry murdered Becket were right. The people who noticed that the Templars' accusers had enormous debts to erase were right. The people who found the Borgia dinner's aftermath suspicious were right. Being right didn't protect them. It didn't change anything in the moment. But their whispers became part of the historical record, and the historical record, examined carefully, tells us what actually happened. That's worth something. That might be worth everything. Tonight the lights can come back on. But maybe remember, the next time someone tells you that powerful people always operate in the open, and that shadowy conspiracies are the fantasies of the paranoid, that for most of human history the paranoid, ones were the ones paying attention. Sleep well, and subscribe if you haven't already, because next time we're going somewhere even darker.